Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a story where love is tested in silence. What would you do if everything seemed peaceful, but someone was quietly pulling your family apart from the inside? Stay with me to uncover what happens next. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The decision didn't come with anger. It didn't come with shouting. And it definitely didn't come easily. It came after a long silence. The kind of silence that only happens when someone has already gone through every possible choice in their mind and realized there's only one path left. The CEO stood outside the gates of his family home, the place he once walked in and out of without thinking, the place where everything had always been certain, controlled, expected. Now, it felt different. He wasn't coming back as a son. He was coming back as someone with a condition, a demand, a line he refused to let anyone cross again. He took a slow breath, then stepped inside. The house hadn't changed. Everything was exactly where it used to be. The furniture, the lighting, the quiet, almost suffocating order of it all. Nothing out of place, nothing unexpected. Just like her, his mother, she was already there, sitting in the main living room, a cup of tea in her hand, as if she had been expecting this moment from the beginning. Because she had. She always did. "You're back." Her voice was calm, no surprise, no warmth, just acknowledgement. He didn't sit, didn't move closer. He stayed where he was, standing, facing her. "I need to talk." She placed the cup down slowly, then looked up at him. "For the first time in days, you come back, and this is how you speak to me?" A small pause. No greeting. He didn't react, because he knew this wasn't about manners, it was about control. And he wasn't here to play that game. "I'm not here as your son today." The words came out quietly, but clearly. "I'm here as someone making a decision." That made her pause, just for a second. But it was enough, because she understood what that meant. "Go on." He stepped forward, not close, but closer. "I'll come back to the company." Her expression didn't change, not yet. "I'll take responsibility for everything." A pause. "I'll rebuild it, expand it, make it stronger than before." Now, she was listening, not emotionally, but strategically, because this was what she had always wanted. But she didn't speak. She waited, because she knew there was more. There's one condition. There it was. The part she had been expecting, the part that mattered most. Tieu Lac stays. Silence. The room seemed to hold its breath. "She stays here." His voice didn't rise, didn't shake, but it didn't move either. "And I take care of her, and the child." Another pause. "I don't want interference." The words were simple, but the meaning was not. Because this wasn't a request, it was a boundary. His mother leaned back slightly, her fingers resting lightly on the arm of the chair. Her eyes, sharp, focused, calculating. "You're negotiating with me." Not a question, a statement. He didn't deny it. "Yes." A long silence followed, because for the first time, the dynamic had changed. He wasn't asking for permission. He was offering something in return, and she had to decide if it was worth it. "You think you can handle both?" Her voice softened slightly, but not with kindness, with doubt. "With everything you've chosen to give up, you still believe you can carry this?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes." Too fast. Too certain. And that made her study him more carefully, because confidence like that either breaks quickly or changes everything. Inside her mind, something else was moving. Not resistance, not anger, but calculation. Because she didn't need to fight him directly, not anymore. She had seen enough to know. Force would only push him further away. But time, pressure, subtle influence, that was different. That was something she understood perfectly. She doesn't belong here. Her voice came again, slower, measured. She won't survive this environment. A pause, and neither will your feelings. He didn't respond, because he knew this wasn't about truth. This was about testing him, pushing him, seeing where he would bend. But he didn't, not this time. She stays, he repeated, simpler, stronger, final. Another long silence. Then his mother exhaled slowly, almost unnoticeable. But it was there, because now she had made her decision, not out loud, not immediately, but inside. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm again, controlled. Fine. The word landed softly, but it changed everything. You can bring her here. A pause. I'll allow it. He didn't react, didn't show relief, because he knew this wasn't acceptance, this was something else. But understand this. Her eyes met his, direct, unwavering. This is temporary. Another pause. You believe you can protect her. A slight tilt of her head. Let's see how long that lasts. There it was. Not a threat, not exactly, but something worse. A quiet promise. He nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because he understood. This wasn't over, it was just beginning. When he left the house, the air outside felt different, not lighter, but clearer. Because now, everything was out in the open. No more guessing, no more pretending. Just reality. And the path forward. Back at the hospital, Tieu Lac looked up the moment he entered, her eyes searching his face, waiting. Not for words, but for truth. He walked closer, sat beside her, and for a moment, he didn't speak, because even good news carries weight. She agreed. The words came quietly. Tieu Lac's fingers tightened slightly. What? She agreed to let you stay. A pause. With me. Silence, not relief, not joy, just stillness. Because something about it didn't feel right. She wouldn't do that for no reason. Tieu Lac's voice was soft, careful, and she was right. Of course she was. He didn't deny it. She has her reasons. A pause. So do I. Tieu Lac looked down at the baby, then back at him, her expression complicated. Not just happiness, not just fear, but both. At the same time. Then we stay. The words came slowly, but clearly, because even knowing the risk, she had already chosen. He nodded, and for the first time in a long time, they were stepping into something together, not running, not hiding, but facing it. But somewhere else, in a quiet room filled with perfect order. His mother sat alone again. A faint smile touched her lips. Not warm, not kind, but certain. Let's see, she murmured softly. How long love lasts under pressure. And just like that, the game had begun. Not loud, not obvious, but precise, careful, and dangerous. Because sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones you don't see coming. Back in the hospital room, the baby made a small sound. Alive, present, fighting, and for now, that was enough. But the real question remained, in a world designed to pull them apart, can they really stay together? The move didn't feel like a victory. It felt like stepping into something unknown. The day Tieu Lac arrived at the CEO's family house, the sky was clear. Too clear, the kind of calm that usually comes before something changes. She stood at the entrance for a moment, holding the baby close to her chest. The child was sleeping, her tiny breath soft and steady against Tieu Lac's skin. Safe. For now. The CEO stood beside her, close, but not relaxed, because even though he had won this moment, he knew exactly where they were standing. Inside his mother's world. And in that world, nothing came without a price. Let's go in, he said quietly. Tieu Lac nodded, but her steps were slow, careful, as if every inch forward mattered. The house welcomed them the same way it welcomed everything else. Silently, perfectly, cold. Nothing had changed since the last time, but everything felt different. Because now, she wasn't just visiting, she was staying, and that alone changed everything. The staff stood at a distance, respectful, quiet, but watching, always watching. Tieu Lac felt it immediately, the weight of unfamiliar eyes, the quiet judgment, the unspoken question, who is she? And why is she here? She lowered her gaze slightly, not in shame, but in awareness, because she knew this wasn't her world, not yet, maybe not ever. His mother appeared shortly after, not rushed, not surprised, as if she had timed everything perfectly, which she probably had. Her eyes moved first to the baby, then to Tieu Lac, then finally to him. You've brought them. Her voice was calm, measured, but not welcoming. The CEO didn't respond to the tone, only the words. Yes. A pause. They're staying. Silence, the kind that stretched just long enough to remind everyone. This wasn't simple. This wasn't settled. This was conditional. His mother stepped closer, slowly, her gaze resting on the baby. Longer this time, studying, observing. The child shifted slightly in Tieu Lac's arms. A small sound escaped her lips. And for a moment, something in the older woman's expression flickered. Not warmth, but something less rigid, less certain. But it was gone just as quickly. She's small. A simple observation, but heavy. Tieu Lac nodded slightly. She's still recovering. Her voice was soft, respectful, but not weak. His mother glanced at her, just briefly, as if acknowledging that she had spoken, but nothing more. The room is ready. She turned her attention back to the CEO. They'll stay in the East Wing. A pause. It's quieter there. Everything was already arranged. Of course it was. He nodded. Thank you. The words felt strange, but necessary, because this was the agreement. The first few days passed. Quietly. Too quietly. At first it felt like nothing was happening. No conflict, no arguments, no direct pressure, and that was what made it unsettling, because silence in a place like this was never empty. It was preparation. Tieu Lac adjusted slowly, learning the space, the routines, the unspoken rules. She woke early, took care of the baby, kept everything simple, stayed out of the way, not because she was afraid, but because she understood. This wasn't a place where you fought openly. This was a place where everything happened beneath the surface. The CEO returned to the company almost immediately. Meetings, calls, decisions. Everything came back at once, and he stepped into it. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Because this was the price, and he was willing to pay it. But the distance, it started quietly. At first, it was just time. Longer hours, later nights, fewer conversations, nothing obvious, nothing dramatic. But enough. Enough to be felt. One evening, Tieu Lac sat by the window, gently rocking the baby in her arms. The child was sleeping again. Peaceful, unaware. Tieu Lac's eyes drifted toward the door, waiting. Not anxiously, not impatiently, just waiting. The clock moved slowly. The house stayed quiet. And when he finally returned, it was late. He stepped in quietly, trying not to wake the baby. "You're still up." His voice was soft, tired. Tieu Lac smiled faintly. "I wanted to wait." A pause. "How was your day?" He hesitated, just for a second. Then, "Busy." A simple answer, but it carried distance. She nodded, didn't push, didn't ask more, because she understood, or at least, she told herself she did. From the hallway, a shadow paused, unseen, unheard, watching. His mother. The next morning, things shifted, not loudly, not directly, but clearly. Tieu Lac found a woman waiting outside her room, elegant, well-dressed, smiling politely. "I'm here to assist with the baby." Her tone was gentle, professional, but something about it didn't feel like help. It felt like replacement. Tieu Lac held the baby closer. "I can take care of her." The woman smiled again. "Of course she did." "I'm sure you can." A pause. But Madame insisted. There it was, not a suggestion, not an offer, a decision already made. Later that day, the CEO didn't know, not yet. He was still at work, still trying to rebuild something that had already started pulling him away. And inside the house, the pieces began to move, carefully, quietly, exactly as planned. His mother sat in her usual place, calm, composed, watching everything unfold, not interfering directly, not forcing anything. Because she didn't need to. Time would do the work, distance would do the work, doubt would do the work. And slowly, without anyone realizing it, things would change. That evening, when the CEO returned, Tieu Lac didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, and for the first time, there was something new in her eyes. Not fear, not sadness, but uncertainty. And that was enough. Because the moment uncertainty enters, everything else follows. He noticed it immediately. "What's wrong?" She hesitated, then shook her head slightly. Nothing. But they both knew that wasn't true. And somewhere, just beyond what they could see, the quiet plan continued. Not loud, not cruel, but effective. Because sometimes you don't break people by force, you let them drift apart. Until one day, they don't even recognize the distance between them. The baby stirred softly in Tieu Lac's arms. Alive, fragile, still the center of everything. But now, no longer the only thing at risk, and the question lingered, not if they would be tested, but when, and whether love could survive a battle it didn't even know had already begun. After returning to the city, Tieu Lac and the CEO move into his family home under a fragile agreement. While everything appears calm on the surface, his mother begins quietly executing her plan. She doesn't confront them directly, but instead creates distance, bringing in someone else to care for the baby and subtly separating Tieu Lac from her role. Meanwhile, the CEO becomes increasingly occupied with rebuilding the company, leaving less time for Tieu Lac. The emotional gap between them slowly grows, not through conflict, but through silence and unspoken tension. Tieu Lac begins to feel out of place and uncertain, sensing that something is changing but unable to stop it. As the mother watches from the shadows, her strategy unfolds perfectly. Now the real danger isn't obvious. It's the quiet drift that could slowly tear their family apart without them even realizing it.